third episode of Sankofa Conversations. My name is Jerome, and I am so glad this evening because we have a very special guest. He is an author, he is a CEO, he is an activist, but unfortunately he is a Chelsea fan. He's done doing so many great things, but just that one thing he's just not he's not doing too great at. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it is my pleasure to be able to have a conversation this evening with Ben Lindsay, CEO of Power to Fight, author of We Need to Talk About Race. And I heard that you're studying for a PhD as well.
Yeah, thank you for having me, first of all.
No worries.
It's been a long time coming, so thank you for having me. Yeah, PhD at Durham University. It's a bit, I don't know, like I've got nothing else to do.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
But it's important, it really does link in with the work which we are doing, just looking at kind of education and looking at teaching and cultural sensitivity and stuff like that. So it's exciting. It links very much with the stuff which I'm involved in. So
for those of those that are watching that may not know, I mean, what is Power to Fight? What's it about? What's its purpose? Just fill us in.
No, it's cool. So Power to Fight is a charity which launched in 2019, but it became kind of in my mind and was created off the back of 2 murders in 2016 of young people in South East London. And my history is that I've worked in community safety teams, youth offending service. I was a pastor for 12 years. I was a mentor. I've done mental health charities. And all that combination of that work kind of got me to the point where I felt we could develop something to help young people kind of move away from violence. So Power to Fight kind of came from out of a place of real hurt. The young man, one of the young people who was killed, a young man called Myron Yard, was a family friend, and I knew his older sister, or know his older sister really well, so it was the closest young person I'd lost. So that kind of galvanized me to think what we can do. So Power to Fight, in a nutshell, the tagline is empowering communities to end youth violence. And we do 4 things. We train and equip anybody who's front-facing with the issue of young people and violence. We've trained over 13,000 practitioners in the last 4 years, looking at contextual safeguarding, how to become a more culturally sensitive organisation, understanding violence against women and girls, how to become a trauma-informed organisation, gang exit strategies. And we work with lots of practitioners across and trainers across the country because we think collaboration is really important. The second thing is that we have podcasts, which you've been on yourself. I have been, Power Talks, which was really important for me because I wanted to show innovators and people, particularly black and brown people who are doing amazing work with young people. And we've got 4 seasons of that, and we've interviewed everybody from yourself to politicians, to musicians, everyone who I feel are actually doing something, academics, people are doing incredible work and you can learn something from. The third thing is that we support families. So we do this in a couple of ways. One is that we financially support families who have lost young people to violence. So we've given over £33,000 to over 66 families in the last 4 years as an unrestricted gift. And we've signposted and we've helped pay for funerals or therapeutic support and stuff like that. The second part of that is that we work with the NHS in a partnership with South London and Maudsley Mental Health Trust, where we support families who are either involved or have been impacted by violence. And our clinical psychologists and our counsellors work with the SLAM counsellors and psychologists to create a more culturally sensitive practice. And then the fourth thing, which I'm really proud about, is our Therapeutic Intervention for Peace program, which goes into schools and in schools in South East London. And it's a co-produced, co-designed mental health program which helps young people with their well-being. And we've seen well-being improve, and we've seen school exclusions being reduced. But it's not just about the young people. We also work with teachers and help with their emotional health and train them in cultural sensitivity and give them reflective spaces, but but we also do the same thing with parents and carers as well.
Yeah.
So we work with over 400 young people and over 200 teachers in the last 4 years.
So it's really like a holistic approach to the issue of serious youth violence.
Yeah, and it has to be, if I'm honest, because I think we have to go beyond the headlines.
Yeah.
So we always see when we have this conversation around violence affecting young people, we see the headlines, we see the stats, we see maybe black kids with balaclavas and you see the zombie nights and stuff, and it's so much more complicated than that. First of all, I'd say it's not a black issue. It disproportionately impacts black and brown communities in a London context, but that wouldn't be the same across the country in other spaces. And just having those types of nuanced conversations is really important in terms of people's practice and looking at people's biases, really. Like, okay, how do you approach communities who have been traumatized by violence, who've been impacted by violence? How do we help them heal? How do we empower them and give them the voices? And the key thing about Power to Fight is that we try to do what we call working on the ground, so ground engagement with some of the stuff I've spoken about. But there's this air engagement as well, which we look at with policy and decision making, local government, central government. And that's something where we're very good at in that advocacy space as well. That we're kind of that conduit between the ground and the air. So yeah, it's a holistic, it's systems, it's looking at structures and institutions and how you challenge that level of oppression which impacts minoritized communities. So it's definitely a holistic approach.
And that kind of, I guess, to some extent, it leads us into our first kind of conversation and question this evening, which is, our previous episode, we had a couple of police officers and who really gave their perspective on what this whole intersection between race and church and community, and how the church can step into that space and to be an advocate and help in that. And so we had the kind of the police side of it, and I think our desire for this conversation is the community element. And so what are your thoughts on when it comes to serious youth violence, when it comes to racism and the community? What's your thoughts on those things, where we are right now?
Yeah, it's a really important question. Particularly, we've just come off the weekend of 30 years since Stephen Lawrence was murdered, and that combination of race, police and violence really does come out in the Stephen Lawrence story. So it's really important that we do acknowledge that. I think it's important to say that race and violence shouldn't be something which necessarily just goes together, because I think that's dangerous, and I don't agree with that. So I think this is why context is really important, and we're saying, okay, in what context are we speaking about? So we work across the country, but I'm South East London based. So in the South East London context, or a London context, we know that the relationship between between black and brown communities and the police is not great. It's probably an understatement. It's at an all-time low. We've just had the Casey report, which has come out, and which is again, and I say again because there's been multiple reports since, Scarman in the 80s and McPherson, which has also said, there's institutional racism.
It's kind of the same thing.
It's the same thing, yeah. It's just remixed, right? It's kind of repackaged and remixed, and every decade we have something which says that. So I think there is something which is going on, which I don't know how we address something which has been there since, the days of my parents, when they came to this country, since the 50s. The relationship between black and brown communities and the police hasn't been great. I think when it comes to what we're seeing in this day and age, it's problematic because we're still, 9 to 1, you're going to see black people more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. That's a really scary statistic, And during the pandemic, there was only I think 83% of all stop and searches on black and brown people resulted in no further action. So, if if I was only good at 17% of my job, you know, then I wouldn't be in a job, you know. So I think we have to really look at, and even what's interesting now is that clearly because of the tragic events of what happened with Sarah Everard, and also the tragic events of what we've seen with Bieber and Nicole, where, you know, the police have also been in a situation where they've just absolutely lost trust with the community, particularly around women. I think it all adds up to this, what a lot of black and brown communities have always been saying, that the trust levels are not there with the police. And therefore we are in a really challenging space at the moment. I think we have to go beyond the, you know, it's just a couple of bad apples. I think we know that isn't the case. We know there's structural and institutional issues. And we need to acknowledge it. We need to admit any problem we have, if we're going to move forward, there has to be an acknowledgement. And that's why it's quite sad when you don't have the commissioner making it obvious that there's institutional racism in the force. So it's definitely a complicated time. And yeah, how we improve, I don't know, if I'm honest.
Okay, I mean, from what you mentioned, there's a historical context to it, as you said. I mean, it's this weekend, or last weekend, is 30 years since the tragic murder of Stephen Lawrence. We can go back to the New Cross fires. Like, we can just keep going back and back and back. But some would say, or is it worse now? Is it?
Yeah, this is a really interesting conversation. I was talking to my mum about this. For me, I've always liked to talk to older people because, you know, we don't often have the intergenerational conversations that we should be having. So, as you said, this weekend was the 30 years of Stephen Lawrence's murder, which for me, growing up in South East London, and I was 15 at the time, and some of my friends knew Stephen and went to church with his family, and I went to school a mile away from where Stephen was murdered, and you know, it was a horrible time for black people growing up in that time. We have to appreciate there was Roland Adams, who was killed in 1991 in Thamesmead, and there's Rowett Dougal, Asian young man who was killed in 1992 in Eltham. So there was a history of violence and young people, black young people, being hunted by the National Front. So when we ask the question, has it really changed? Context is everything. As I was talking to my mum, she was like, you know what, Ben, the thing is, the way I talk and the way you talk in this day and age is not something which our parents could talk in that same way. Yeah. Like, we have platforms which allow us to be very open and honest about our experiences. They didn't have the same platforms you had. Obviously, activists, you know, you think of like Darkest Howl and people like that, but it feels like there's a lot more with social media and stuff. There's a lot more people who can share their experiences and stuff. So in one hand, that's demonstrated change. But if we're then going to be talking about actually the experiences of black and brown people, okay, am I being chased by the National Front in the way that I was in the 90s? No. But that doesn't mean that racism isn't still as insidious and still as dark and still as damaging, because some of it is not always the obvious stuff. It's the stuff you don't see. It is the structural. It is the institutional. It is the institutional and the structural and the symbolic side of stuff, which we don't often want to talk about. So for me, it's a yes and no answer. If I'm honest, I think there would be elements where things have got better. But if you look at unemployment rates and you look at the people who have been impacted by COVID when it happened, when you look at stop and search, when you look at school exclusion rates, when you look at the mental health issues in this country, black and brown people tend to be at the bottom of the league table of these things. So I think we have to be careful, and I don't believe we're in a post-racial society where everything is great. I think some things have got, I mean, look, if you're going to be honest, we've got a brown Muslim mayor, you know, an Asian prime minister. Now, I think it would be dangerous to look at that and say, well, that's progress. Yeah. But I definitely know that wasn't happening in the 80s and 90s as well. So it's a funny one. But I think as black people, we are still struggling, and there's a lot of things which still need to be addressed.
And so in your experience, I mean, like what's been your experience of working with the community? I mean, we said before we came on camera that you have a history of working with the community. That's your heartbeat from way back. And so, I mean, what's been some of your experiences working with the community? And you talked about being a church leader as well.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've been working with the community, our community, in different guises since 2001. And it's really important actually at this point, like prior to that, so I came out of university in 1999, had a couple of jobs working in the city, but then it wasn't until 2001 that I became a Christian. I grew up in a Christian home. And I remember doing an Alpha course, and I had the salvation, you know, the personal salvation. You're like, I realize who Jesus is. Oh, this is my Lord and Savior. Okay, I'm forgiven for my sins. I believe, and so, all right, not to minimize that, tick, okay? Got it. But then something else also happened to me where I was realized in that moment in 2001, what does this mean? What does the gospel mean for the community around me? Like, I get it. Is it this evangelical approach to Christianity is very much about my personal salvation, but quickly I felt God saying, but what does this mean for the community? What does the local church mean for the community around me? What does Ben Lindsay mean? Not that I like talking in third person, but yeah. What is this? What does this mean? What do I now bring? And I remember very quickly saying to my church leaders at the time, yo, what are we doing for the community? Are we, like, you know, there's lots of young people who are struggling. Are we opening up our doors? Are we mentoring? Are we supporting? Are we giving money? This was in 2001. So that, for me, was always my desire to see churches with, like, no one can see it, but we're in this fantastic church building, right? And there's lots of buildings across, all the streets of the UK, which are often empty at a time when young people are feeling most vulnerable, which tends to be after school. Why are they not open? The church has got the biggest volunteer service in the UK. Why are we not volunteering? Like, big up street pastors and all that, but I think we can also do a lot more, right? We have, depending on your theology, unlimited resources, financial resources from heaven. Why are we not praying for money to be really invested in the community? If we did all that, we wouldn't be begging for grants and foundations and stuff like that. So my experience of the community is that it's funny, when I was a church leader, you know what it's like, the barbershop conversations, right? So you're a church leader now, and the barbershop conversations are different because you're in there.
They have a different level of authenticity.
Yeah, but you're in the conversation now, and obviously you know what it's like. You're talking football, you're talking politics, and then you'll talk about faith. So I'm in the barbershop, and you got the dread in there, and you got the Muslim in there, and you got you got the Rasta. And then you got the Christians as well. And I remember having these conversations, and people are like, but hold on, you're a Christian. That's a white man's religion. And oh, you're a Christian. Where's the church? You're a church pastor. Let me look at your watch. Let me look at your car. I'm like, bro, nah, man, I'm not that guy. I haven't got a Rolex on. You know, I drive a Skoda. I've got three children. You know, it's not how it is. You know, but the mentality is ultimately, why is the church never where we need them? We never see the church leaders investing in the things that we care about. So for me, I'm like, okay, when you really listen to the community, you really understand their hurt and their pain. And I remember being in churches like this. You remember these days when we had a lot of violence inside. We still have a lot of violence, but we were able to bring the community together, and we were able to talk to our police leaders and our local authority leaders, and we were able to pray for them as well, and we were able to take questions, and we'd pray on a regular basis. The community, there's a desire for things to be better, but the question we've got to ask ourselves, are we listening? And that's why, for me, my charity is so important, because we try and take the voices of the community and push them upstream.
Yeah.
So we can say to the mayor, we can say to MPs, and we can say to policymakers that this is really what the streets are saying, this is where the real need is. But if you don't have those conduits, you don't have those people as Christians, I can say, who understand that the gospel isn't just about your own personal salvation, it's about the fabric or the community as well. Who is your neighbour? Let's go back to Bible 101.
Yeah.
Who is your neighbour? Right? And too many people, and I make no apology what I'm about to say, too many people will want to give money to African nations but don't want to support the African children and families on their doorstep. And that's not me saying that we shouldn't give money to African nations, but the reality is, who's your neighbour?
Yeah.
Are we engaging in that level as well?
So for you, in 2001, when you became a Christian, there was a colliding of your kind of two worlds effectively, and it was the question was in your, I guess, your own theological reflection, if you could call it that, to say there needs to be some practical implications to my faith in Jesus Christ. And so now we move forward from 2001 to now. You've been a church leader, and depending on how you would define it, you still are a church leader, because you mean, why does church leadership have to be connected to a salary or to this or all of those things?
It helps though.
But we've highlighted the historical context and the theological implications of our faith, but we've still got this gap where it feels like maybe the church is not stepping into that space. What is it that, when you close your eyes, you see the church doing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, a famous pastor once said that the local church is the hope of the world, which I agree with to an extent. I think if that church is embedded in the community and is culturally aware, culturally sensitive, culturally intelligent, and really understands the communities which they are serving, then they can be part of the solution. And when I close my eyes and I think to myself, what could a church be? I see a diverse in age and race and gender, backgrounds, experiences, very much in that Revelation 5 and 7, you know, everyone coming together, everybody worshipping from different tribes, different backgrounds. That's my ideal, but the reality, and I talk a lot about this in the book, this is not straightforward.
No.
Because everybody comes with their own biases, everyone comes with their own perspectives, everyone has this kind of view of what church should be. And that's the beautiful thing about the Christian faith, that you can have multiple different versions and perspectives and kind of iterations of what church looks like. But they all should be welcoming. They should all feel like a person can belong. And I do believe, when I close my eyes, I see pastors becoming more culturally sensitive. This term, right? And I'll keep saying this, so let me just unpack it a little bit, because like, we put out a report with the Mayor of London in 2020 looking at cultural competency in therapeutic spaces, right? So when you look at cultural competency, it's really like, are you culturally aware and intelligent about the communities that you are around? But when I started unpacking competency, I was a bit like, actually, what competency means mastery, and therefore you can't really master culture. So when I started looking into this stuff, other terms such as cultural sensitivity and cultural humility I started reading about. And those terms are a lot more, are you taking a posture of learning? Are you humbling yourself to engage with the fluid culture that we are in? What do I mean by fluid culture? Okay, let's take Peckham. Peckham in 2023 isn't the same as Peckham in 1993, right? In 1993, well, I don't know, when I say Peckham to some people watching this, they might think, oh, I remember Only Fools and Horses, or I remember Desmond's, or actually, I think Gigs, right? So whatever your view is.
But even that, you've highlighted that there is a fluidity.
There's a fluidity of what we're talking about. But where our offices are in Peckham, you know, there's more rooftop bars, there's more coffee shops, there's more restaurants which are hyper expensive along Peckham High Street than I've ever seen before. And we can get into gentrification and all that type of stuff, but ultimately the culture has shifted. Are pastors and church leaders, and are we prepared to shift?
Yeah.
Now, let me be clear in what I'm saying. I'm not saying shift from the gospel.
No.
I'm saying, are we prepared to understand the context that we are working? Look, Jesus was born at a particular time in history, and therefore he represented the culture of that time. Yeah. Right? And so therefore I've got no problem with us. Are we prepared? But too many church leaders are like, no, we're going to read the Bible in this way, I'm going to use the same illustrations. And let me get really into it. You can't serve a community if your leadership team doesn't look like the community. Yeah, let's just be real. The church of Antioch and the leaders in that space, they were from the community, and it was a real mix. But too many church leaders, or in some church context, what you've got is church leadership what does not represent the community around them. So when I think about the community, I love the community around me, but I think the church really has the opportunity to step up, particularly after George Floyd. Yeah. That was like an open goal for everyone to be like, all right, cool, let's really have this conversation. Yeah. The reality is though, what has changed since George Floyd? Yeah.
And you talked about that cultural humility and bringing that posture of learning to the table when it comes to this conversation and topics like racism, institutional racism, policing, all of those things. So what would you say are how does someone embody that on a practical level?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because we can use all these like terms, but it can be a bit airy-fairy, right? So for me, the first thing about it is that if you're going to serve a community, are you prepared to learn from that community? So on a basic level, who are you spending time with? Who are you inviting round for dinner? Or who are you going to the pub with? Or who are you going for a run with? Or who are you playing tennis with? Whatever you do in social context, who are you engaging with? And it's very simple to know whether the people you engage with are like you or they're different. Just check the last 5 texts on your phone and see who you text, and see if it's all people like you or you've got a real mix of people. So on just a basic level, you can attempt to pursue people who are not like you, and it's scary, I get it, but you've got an opportunity to do that. Okay, now let's talk about, that's an interpersonal kind of conversation. Let's talk about institutional now. All right, cool. So if you're an institution such as the church, are you prepared to invest in training to upskill these vicars, these pastors, who often, let's be real, often come from outside of London? I'm talking a London context here, or outside of inner cities, because London's shiny and great and amazing, and they land, and the question I've got, and this goes for teachers, pastors, and police, are you culturally sensitive to be working in these communities? Because when I was a church pastor, and I've said this multiple times, but I'll say it again, when I was a church pastor, we often got teachers coming in, working from Teach First, and they come from places like the Valleys of Wales and all that type of stuff. And I'll be like, oh, hello, and they'll be like, yeah, I'm here, and I'm really excited. I'm really excited to be coming into the inner cities, and they're like, all right, cool. And in my mind, I'm going to give you 3 months. And then 3 months comes, and it's like, oh my goodness, I'm struggling with the young people, and the parents and carers don't get me, and I'm living in an estate which I thought was really cool, but it's really scary. And I'm like, all right, cool. And the reason why you're like that is because the only experience you've had of black and brown people is watching Top Boy. And that is a problem, because I need more than you getting your reference points from a program which is primarily about drugs and gangs and violence, and that's the reference point you're now teaching my kids.
Yeah.
So institutionally, churches and schools, are you prepared to train your teachers, invest in your pastors, invest in your doctors, invest in your police, invest in your MPs to be culturally understanding, aware, intelligent, to really learn how to, and this is the important word, serve your communities around.
Yeah.
So there's an interpersonal, who you hanging around with on a Saturday night in your dinner party, who you inviting around, and then there's this institutional level, and then there's this structural conversation which is more complicated, because this is often the stuff which we have around our government, and the things which we don't see, and often the things we don't have the influence in, and that can be a bit hard when you've then seen reviews and reports and stuff coming out, which sometimes feel like they contradict the reality of what we're actually going on the ground. So it's multiple layers, right? And not only is it multiple layers, sometimes it's multiple narratives, and sometimes it's contradicting narratives.
Yeah.
So what we then don't want to get into is tokenism. All right, cool. Well, we've got Jerome on as an elder or on our board of trustees. So he's representing everybody. But here's Ben, and I'm like, well, I don't know. I like Jerome's cool, but he doesn't represent me. Maybe Jerome's middle class and went to uni, and Ben is working class and didn't go to uni, and yeah, we're same skin color, but
we've had different
experiences. But that doesn't matter. But Jerome's the black man, so he represents. Even that conversation there, we don't ever like to talk about the different classes in black communities. We just say black people. We never say, whoa, how about that person's black middle class or black person's black working class. When it comes to black people and race, we don't talk about class, right? So, but with white people, we tend, in the white population, we're quite comfortable in talking about
working class, middle class.
But when it comes to black people, so even some of the things I'm saying here, how are we really, what do we think of our neighbour in our church context? How do we engage? And then the final thing I would say on this is our young people. What are we doing in how we're engaging with young people? Because the way social media is moving, the things young people are into, gosh, when I was a youth worker in a church, I prided myself in keeping on top of what young people were into, all right? That was years ago. I'm not into everything.
You look good though, man.
Yeah, I'm all right. I'm all right. But I used to have hair like you and everything. So it's all. But young people, like how are we engaging with our young people as well?
I really love the way that you kind of, you started at the bottom, and where you were saying, look, actually, interpersonal relationships, and it is very practical. I think, as you said, like we have these words, and they are very helpful concepts for us to shape our thinking on, but actually, like on a day-to-day basis, like if, as you said, if the people in the people in the GC, in the WhatsApp group, that if it's all similar people, if you don't have any converging, everyone's ideas are converging, no one's diverging from each other or anything like that, it does become very difficult to hear and know that there are different experiences in life other than your own.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's weird to think that people don't really think that way. it's like, we've all had different experiences, I'm fortunate to have really good friends who have come from different parts of Africa and different parts of the Caribbean, and black friends who have come from America, and it's only when you all hang out together you realise you're the same but you're different. And that's the beauty of it, right? And I love meeting this whole kind of no new friends. We can get into a conversation about what really friend means. But I love meeting new people and learning, again, the posture of learning. And I think this intergenerational conversation is really important. When was the last time you saw, a teenager, someone our age or my age, and then an elder, just chopping it up over food? right? And I guarantee all three of those people will find each of us annoying in that context.
Yeah.
But I guarantee you'll walk away with a richer understanding. It's like it's something. It's a lost art of conversation.
So having those voices that are different to yours in the conversation that can help enrich, obviously your personal experience, but as you said, help us to learn and begin to see society not just from our personal perspective, because
I mean, look, we got to look at Brexit, right? This was something which I learned when Brexit happened, because I am so London centric. The echo chamber I was in was like, oh, just from what I'm seeing around me.
Yeah.
The idea we're actually going to leave the European Union, don't be silly, come on. I'm in London, it's Labour, you know, all my timeline is Remain. Oh no, there's a world outside of London who don't think like me, who've got different experiences to me, who've got different views, and guess what? They don't necessarily agree with my timeline.
Yeah.
And we're suddenly out of the European Union. That was one of the first times when I was like, wow, there's a big world out there with different experiences, you know? And I think that always makes me think that actually I get to travel across the UK in different spaces now more than ever. And I'm just always cautious. I'm just like, okay, we're not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah, 100.
So it's good, and it's also, you know, keeps you on your toes as well.
You talked about the importance of the intergenerational conversation. I mean, where do we see young, middle-aged, old having that? And really, I mean, the church should be that place.
Oh gosh, it has to be that place. Like, when I think back to my mum taking me to church, there was always older people, older women, older men in that context. When I go back to my grandma's church, there's always older people, and this is the beauty of church, really. You don't know who you're sitting next to.
Yeah.
And that there's not many spaces in this world where you choose to go somewhere on a Sunday, sit down with people who are completely from a different background from you, right? And that is really wonderful, and I think that is the true essence of the gospel. Jesus Christ is for everyone. Jesus Christ is for everyone, but how it's packaged and presented isn't for everyone.
Because I want to ask you, you talked about, we often don't talk about class and race. And I feel like we often don't talk about class, race and the church, and how actually in the church context, we are not just divided along racial lines, but we're also divided upon in class lines as well. So, I mean, you've been a church leader, you are a church leader, and you've led churches. In that space, how we're saying we want to help the community, we need to serve the community, we need to do this, we need to, I mean, listen and all these type of things, but if we're not even doing it in our own yard, as I would call it.
No, this is a good point, and it's important to say this. Church leaders set the culture, no matter what, right? The church leader sets the culture of the church. If the church leader is inclusive, if the church leader speaks about minoritized issues, if the church leader on a regular basis is saying, look guys, I know you guys are all from you're white and middle class, and I know all you guys are black and middle class, or I know all you guys are from the Chinese community, it's really easy for you just to stick but no, we're going to do some stuff where we're almost forcing you to kind of mingle, right? And that's not to say that you don't have preference and who you really connect with. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but church leaders on a regular basis, in the same way, I guarantee most church leaders will have at least maybe 2 or 3 times a year when they're talking about money. Yeah, to be honest, I'm not saying that there's a bad motive behind that, because we're taught to give and the lights need to be turned on. Okay, cool. How often though do we talk about this feeling of belonging, this feeling of diversity and community? I've been in churches, unfortunately, where it's like, I can't get into that circle because you're all one way, you're all brethrens, you all go on holiday together, and me, the black guy, is never invited.
Yeah.
Never. I've been in churches where it's like, oh, no, you're always going to the farm together. You're always going, you're always going out of London together, and I don't get an invite.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Now, some people might be like, well, it's up to them. It's cool. But how are we doing diversity?
Yeah.
Right? I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm saying there has to be moments when we have to be like, what does the body look like?
Yeah.
How do we really connect on multiple levels? How do we demonstrate to the world outside of the church context that this is what God has designed?
Yeah.
Different tribes, different tongues, all engaging on an interpersonal. And look, we know that's not easy, right? We know there's going to be beef. We know it gets complicated. We know it gets techie. We know it gets misunderstandings happen. Okay, but you need church leaders to be strong to say, particularly in areas like Southeast London or diverse areas, are we going to fight for this?
Yeah.
Are we going to have churches that really look like and speak about the issues and contextualize? How are pastors and leaders and vicars really contextualizing the gospel to the community issues that we are dealing with? Some of us are so lazy in our illustrations. No. Think about the illustrations which are going to connect the gospel to the experiences that people are living
on a
day-to-day basis. Don't be giving me some academic theological illustration which only you and a couple of your brethren are going to get. No, look at the community around. Look, Paul did this, right?
Yeah.
Paul was the master at this. He would go, depending on who he was talking, all things to all people, right?
Yeah.
Why are we not more like that?
I want to kind of move the conversation in a different kind of lane, but I mean, in Acts chapter 6, the widows are being overlooked, and the leaders of that church, they decide that they're going to address the issue, and that issue that the widows are being overlooked, that wasn't just a church issue, that was a societal issue at the time. So the church decides to say, look, we need to address this. And what they do is that they put people in charge of the issue that are from the community that the issue is actually happening in. And it kind of brings me to this point of, we talk a lot about equality, but really, do we need spaces of equity?
Yeah, it's a great question.
And how does the church do that? We talk about acts and, we need to be, but practically today, how do we do that?
Yeah, it's funny, it's something which I think the church is behind. So as a CEO of Power to Fight, I've got a board of trustees. You can go on our website, you can see a real mix of people, a real mix of backgrounds. I also have an advisory board, which is about 20 plus people. And I'm talking about, I've got young people, I've got bankers, I've got police officers, I've got musicians, I've got creatives, I've got heads of service, I've got people who have lost loved ones, I've got people in the arts. It's a real mix of people, right? So it's really important that when we talk about trying to solve the issues that the communities are going through, Act 6 is fascinating because basically the power goes to the minoritized, marginalized communities to go and sort it out. The power goes. I don't see many church spaces where something happens and they say, all right, cool. You're not necessarily a leader, but you have good standing in the community. Come, help us work out this problem. It doesn't really happen like that. Oh, you're not an elder, you haven't got the title, you haven't got all this type of stuff. So really, one of the things where I pride myself in Power to Fight is that it's grown because I've had to listen to multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
And trust me, the first couple of advisory groups was like hell for me, because I'm coming up with all these ideas And I got the atheist saying, "Nah, Ben, why? This is not how I would do it." And I got the Christian saying, "Nah, Ben, this is how you should do it." And I got the Muslim saying, "Nah, Ben, nah." And I've got the young person saying, "Why are you not doing it like that?" And I've got the older person saying, "Nah, but Ben, you must do it like this." And you know, and I'm like sitting there, and I came back, coming back to the first meeting. I said to my wife, "Wow, why do I feel like I've been in the ring with Tyson or something?" And she said to me, "But Ben, this is important. Because if you don't hear these multiple perspectives, you're only going to have a singular view on how you move the charity forward. But we don't have this in a church context. We want everything very much contained in some cases, maybe not all cases, but everything's very contained. The church has to have the voices of the community, and Acts 6 is a brilliant example of when trouble happens, and the people who are being impacted the most by that issue are the ones who are given the responsibility and the power to solve it. I don't see that in many church cases, if I'm honest. How do you empower people? You give them a voice. You help them build the table. You give them the tools. You allow freedom. You allow them to make mistakes if possible. That's the other thing. Black and brown leaders, we're not allowed to make mistakes in the same way that our white counterparts are. That's the reality. So often in a church context, we're struck off. There's examples, live examples now, which I won't go into, where I've seen black leaders being vilified for things which their white counterparts would never.
Do you think part of that is because you alluded to it earlier, Jerome's at the table, so he represents everybody, and so oh, well, when he gets it wrong, we can't let another one through.
I think it has been a bit like that in time. I think I've often questioned, and even in my old church, I was a bit like, but there's a black leader there, and there's a black man there, with a black woman there. Like, why is it just me? This was peak, actually, because I'm there as one of the leaders of the church, and I'm desperate for more black leaders to come through. But I was the only black male leader. So it's only when I left, you know, when you leave an organisation, people start being honest. And some people were like, "But Ben, we thought you were stopping black people coming through." I was like, "What?" I was like, "But it was only you." So some of us just thought, he doesn't want any other. I was just like, "Oh my goodness." I was like, seriously? You see how things can just be totally misunderstood. And I'm like, that was never the situation. That was never the case. That was never the heart. My heart was always to see more black and brown leaders coming through in any contest. And that's why I'm very proud of the fight. I've got black female senior leadership. I've got black female women in my team. I've got black men in my team. You know, it's a very diverse mix of people in my leadership, but we have to be deliberate. And you have to take chances on people. You have to be deliberate, you have to be culturally sensitive, and I don't know if every church, denomination, leadership are prepared to really push the minority. I think that some churches have moved the dial a bit, but it feels still risky, right? Let's just talk it in football terms, right? You only got to look at certain managers. I'm a Chelsea man, as you alluded to earlier on. Right, it's not a great season, but we'll be back. I love Frank Lampard, the player. One of my favourite players ever. And there's not going to be one Chelsea supporter who's going to say Frank Lampard was anything but great. Frank Lampard, the manager, he should never be managing Chelsea. Steven Gerrard, great player. He should never be managing Aston Villa. Yet, you're not seeing the same opportunities given to some black managers or black players, black former players, right? But there's something about white players who are given more opportunities. Scott Parker should never be managing Fulham. Graham Potter should never be managing, like, you see what I'm going with it? I'm just being real. I write about this in my book. This is not like mad theory. This is reality. Okay? And I think what that situation you've seen there plays out in a church context. We see a lot more opportunities for white leaders in church context than you do see for black leaders. And there's multiple reasons for that. And I think historically there's distrust. There's historically, it's kind of like, could they really do the job? Are they competent enough? You know, I've had white leaders say to me, I'm not sure they will stay the course. Well, you're right, actually. A lot of black leaders won't stay the course because we have the microaggressions. We have the fatigue, the integration fatigue, the imposter syndrome, all the words we know. And then by the time you're done, you're just like, I'm spent, I'm tired, I'm ready to go.
One of the things one of the words coming to my mind in everything that you're talking about regarding risk and stepping into that space is courage.
Right.
And I guess as we kind of bring this conversation to a close, like, there clearly is a need for courage and courageous people, whether they be church leaders, whether they be community leaders, police officers, or just layperson within the context of a church. Where does that courage come from? And how do you sustain? We talked about just before all of the great things that Power the Fight are doing, but it's a lonely road.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like Bible study 101, Jesus. But I think there's a few things that drive me, okay? The history of the Bible is God using his people to do great works. Rarely, other than the fact that Jesus came down, or God came down as man, most times in the Bible, God uses his people to move the dial, to demonstrate his power, his grace, his mercy, his wrath. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Depending on what you read. All right? So one of the things when you read the Bible, and I said this before, but one of my favourite characters is Gideon, because Gideon really didn't want it. He was not on this at all. He didn't want no smoke. He was like, I am definitely not that guy. But Gideon was moaning to God a lot. The Midianites are doing this, the Midianites are doing that. And God was like, all right, cool, do something about them. You be careful what you pray for, because God, I think often we ask for stuff and God says, yeah, I totally agree with you, go on. Right? And suddenly you're like, oh no, I don't,
I meant somebody else.
Yeah, I don't mean me. And I think for me personally, I've been praying about, God, this racism in the church thing is mad. I need you to write a book. All right? And I need you to write a book because something's coming. So this is 2017. I need you to write a book because something's coming which is going to question and ask the church what side of the racial justice line they're going to be on. I didn't know George Floyd was coming at that point. All right. But Lord, this knife crime issue, this gang stuff, all this stuff happening, it's breaking me, it's killing my communities. Come and do something. All right. Power the Fight. Go and do something, right? And when you know it's not calculated, when you know there's no kind of malice or selfish ambition to do any of this stuff, that's when you know it's God, and that's when you get the courage. I'm like, look, I was happy being a church leader.
I was going to say, your life was probably, there's probably a paradox of your life was probably easier if you'd have not answered the call.
Maybe, but
actually,
I mean, look, I'm happy. I'm like, I've got this church in amazing community. I'm in my home. I'm loving the community. I'm loving what I'm doing. And if I'm here for the next 25 years, calm.
Yeah. But
God's got something else going on, and I'm going to step in. I'm going to step into that. Courage comes from the Lord. Courage comes from when you are obedient. Courage comes when you step up, right? But you got to step up now. You got the right people around you, right? But you're right. It's a lonely road. Pioneering is always lonely because you're the first person knocking through the doors, right? And Power the Fight, being led by a black man in the charity sector, is not straightforward in the youth sector, because of everything we were talking about earlier on. There's a level of distrust and all this type of stuff. But God, in his mercy and his grace, is allowing us to go step by step by step, and we're moving and we're doing some amazing work. And not just me, there's multiple organisations which are doing great work. But yeah, courage comes from obedience.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
And knowing that what you're doing is actually what God has laid in your heart.
It's hearing from God, right? I think we have this. Yeah, I always find it's quite funny when people say, you know what, I heard from the Lord to go to Africa, and it's always like white middle class people get told by God to go to Africa, to hot places. Like Femi from Peckham never gets told to go to Africa, and the church is going to back Femi or Fumi to go to, I don't know, Miami to go and serve the poor white people in South Beach. It never happens. It tends to be, for me anyway, I don't want to do it, Lord.
Yeah.
I'm quite comfortable. She asked me to do something which I don't really want to do. I don't really want to launch a charity. I don't know what I'm doing. I've never written a book. All right, but you want to change something.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I think there is something about how you hear from God, and you hear from God in multiple ways, right? The interesting thing about the book, first of all, I was in a shower, and I came out of the shower and I had 8 chapters, random, just like, what is this? 8 chapters. Then I sent it to my friend Governor B. He was the only person I knew at the time who'd written a book. I said, bro, this is mad. God has just given me these 8 chapters. What do you think? This is heavy. I'm going to send it to my publisher. Oh, no, don't send it to your publisher yet, bro. He sent it anyway. They came back and said, yeah, we're interested. I still wasn't sure. I went to a wedding, and a woman I'd not seen for years came up to me and said, Ben, I've just been thinking about you recently. I feel God saying that your voice on young people and racism really needs to be amplified. Like, I can see you talking a lot more. And I don't know if this means anything to you, but have you ever written a book? All right. So now there was like, for me, it tends to be multiple signs.
Yeah.
And that's when I know, as opposed to some things, there's some decisions I made because I want to make them.
Yeah.
And they don't always work out well.
Yeah.
And then I have to look back and say, did I hear from God, or was that just me?
Manufacturers,
Yeah, and it doesn't always work that way. I do think and believe in free will. So it's not like, you know, God does, you know, you can do whatever you want. But I think the question, well, no, that's not true. You can't do anything you want. But I think the point is, the question you always have to ask yourself is, any decision you make, is that taking you closer to God or further away from God?
Yeah. You
do what you want, but ultimately, and me having to walk in faith for the book and for Power to Fight meant that I'm having to walk closer with God more than ever. Yeah. And yeah, it's not easy. It's not straightforward. I'm not sitting there saying I've got it all right, but I'm in the place I'm meant to be at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, you and the work that you're doing in Power to Fight, some people are watching. How can they support?
Oh man, listen. First of all, if you're a praying person, pray for us. We're in a cost of living crisis. We are in a healthy position, but you know, things change quickly. So pray for us, pray for our finances. We have 17 members of staff who are doing incredible work across London, across the UK in different ways, training, supporting families. So pray for us and pray for the situations of young people being impacted by violence. If you want to help us financially, go to www.powertofight.org.uk and you can donate on there, register charity, no funny business, so it's all good, you know. And yeah, pray for our kids, pray for our children. And not just kind of the prayers of, Lord, rightfully we pray for the protection of our kids. Pray for the emotional and mental well-being of our children, because it starts here. Yeah. And there's a lot of stuff out there which is twisting up our children's minds. Yeah. And I'm not even talking about the more wicked stuff, just even in the more subtle things that sometimes we see and we allow our children to get involved in, and what they sometimes can clock, and WhatsApp groups and all that type of stuff. just pray for our children and our families, really.
Yeah. Ben, listen, I want to thank you for this evening, because I just think, some of the things that have really stood out to me is that courage for cultural sensitivity, having a posture of learning, and approaching experiences in your life from that perspective is massively important, especially in our day and age where, as Christians, we do need to step out, we do need to step up, and we do need to actually ask ourselves those hard questions of like, do we really care?
Yeah.
Do we really care that people within our congregations are suffering, people within our community is suffering, and what power can we give to, as you said, those underrepresented voices? It's not just platitudes, it's not just, oh, here's a check or here's a, it's like, no, what real power is given so that those unrepresented voices, they're heard, and knowing you, knowing what Power to Fight is about, knowing you as a person, that's what you're about. It's just, how do I elevate the voices that are silenced so that the masses hear the cry of those that are oppressed? And I'd just, thank you so much for this evening, man.
Thank
really
you for having
appreciate
me, man. I really appreciate and respect to what you're doing and what you're bringing. I've known you for a while now. Always bringing excellence to everything you do. So thank you so much for your time, bro.
Awesome. Guys, well, thank you so much for this evening. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great evening, and we'll be back with episode 4, and maybe in the future we'll get him back, but if he's still a Chelsea fan, I'm really not sure.
Arsenal ain't winning nothing. That's what we need to be talking about. Not winning anything.
Listen, guys, enjoy the rest of your evening. Catch you later.